Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining. We're just going to give people a couple more minutes to join the meeting, and then we'll get started. Bonjour à tous et merci de vous joindre à nous. Nous allons donner aux gens quelques minutes de plus pour se connecter, puis nous commencerons. So welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining our webinar on communicating about big deal cancellations. I'm Julie Morin, one of the program officers at CARL, and I'm going to run through a few housekeeping items before we start. Participants have been muted upon entry. You may use the chat feature to bring technical difficulties to our attention or to share comments and resources. Our presenters will also be taking questions at the end, so you're encouraged to type your questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Questions can be asked in French or English and can be translated by CARL staff if necessary. Finally, this webinar is being recorded and will be made available after the session. Slides have been posted in French and English on the CARL website. Links to these and the CARL Code of Conduct have been included at the beginning of the chat thread for convenience. Nos présentatrices répondront aux questions à la fin. Vous êtes donc encouragés à taper vos questions en utilisant la fonction questions et réponses au bas de votre écran. Les questions peuvent être posées en français ou en anglais et peuvent être traduites par le personnel de la BRC si nécessaire. Ce webinaire est en cours d'enregistrement et sera disponible après la session. Des diapositives ont été publiées en français et en anglais sur le site web de la BRC. Les liens vers ceux-ci et le code de conduite de la BRC ont été inclus au début du fil de discussion. Our speakers today are Diane or Dee Dawson, Science and Scholarly Communication Librarian, and Jacqueline McLean, Electronic Resources Librarian, both at the University of Saskatchewan. Not presenting today is the third member of their team, Charlene Sorensen, Associate Dean at the University of Saskatchewan Library, who is currently serving as Interim Dean. Today, they will be discussing the results of a study to determine effective strategies for communicating to the campus community about big deal cancellations and how they recently implemented these findings during their own big deal cancellations at the University of Saskatchewan. This research received funding from CARL in 2017 as part of the Practicing Librarian category of CARL's Research and Librarianship grant. CARL is proud to have been able to contribute to the successful completion of this project and to provide a channel for the recipients to share their results. Thank you, Dee and Jacqueline, for agreeing to share your findings with us. And without further ado, I'll let you take it over from here.
Great, thanks a lot, Julie. To begin with, Jacqueline and I would like to acknowledge that we are presenting this webinar today on Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis. We pay our respects to the First Nation and Métis ancestors of this place. And we are really excited today to discuss with you the results of our research project, communicating to campus communities about collections cancellations, and specifically big deal cancellations. As Julie said, the purpose of this study was to determine effective strategies for communicating about these big deal cancellations, specifically so that faculty will better understand and support the library in making these difficult decisions. And we are really grateful to CARL as well for funding this research through the Practicing Librarian grant and for inviting us to tell you about it today. So this was a two-phase study, and a peer-reviewed article based on this research has just been accepted in college and research libraries for the January 2021 issue. Yay! So if you want to read more details on this research than we'll have time to tell you about today, you can please go to the link on this slide. It's posted in our institutional repository, Harvest. And this is the author accepted version, so it's the final version before the typesetting, etc. Next slide. So here's how we've organized this presentation today. I'll begin by explaining the background or context of the study and why we decided to undertake it, and then what we did, so also known as the methods. But I won't spend too long on that because I'm sure what you're most interested in is what we found out, of course. I'll briefly go through the phase 1 results. So phase 1 was an analysis of publicly available documents posted by Carl libraries on their websites about major collections cancellations. But we'll spend most of this presentation on the phase 2 results, which were interviews with Carl librarians about this topic. We discovered 6 main themes in this interview data. I'll take you through the first 3 of these and then hand off to Jacqueline, who will take you through the rest of them, as well as some specific advice that we heard from these interview participants in our study. So we initiated this study because we had a question and we saw a gap in the literature on this topic, and because we hoped the results would prove useful to librarians, including ourselves perhaps at some future date. And little did we know how soon we would actually be putting these findings into practice. In 2019, so just last year, we here at the USask Library canceled 2 big deals, the Taylor and Francis and Wiley packages. And Jacqueline, as our e-resources librarian, has been heavily involved in this process, both the analysis and the communications part of it. So to end this presentation, she'll tell you a bit about how the library team implemented some of our findings from this research in our own big deal cancellation communications. So we plan to talk for about 40 minutes or so today, and hopefully then there'll be enough time for questions and discussion. And we'd certainly like to hear back from you if you have advice or suggestions of your own. Okay. So let's start with the context. So it's not going to be news to anybody here attending today, I'm sure, that there's been a recent uptick in the number of academic libraries around the world canceling big deals. And we only expect this trend to continue with probable widespread budget cuts that are coming at many institutions. And Spark now is even tracking this phenomenon on a dedicated web page, since the screenshot here you see. And they're also facilitating a community of practice, and they're hosting various webcasts on the topic lately. So it seems to be a topic of growing importance. The main factors probably influencing these recent big deal cancellations worldwide are, first of all, budgetary challenges, of course, either flat budgets or decreases in library budgets. That's nothing new for libraries. Also nothing new, of course, is the unsustainable hyperinflationary price increases of journal and big deal subscriptions. What is perhaps a bit newer is the desire to move towards newer models, such as transformative open access models that include article processing charges for authors from the institution. So these 3 factors are probably the main factors driving. And Canadian libraries are no different, although there is an additional factor for us here in Canada, and that is unpredictable currency fluctuations, of course. So since we pay for much of our collections in American dollars, when the Canadian dollar is low, we have less buying power, and this can happen quickly and unexpectedly sometimes. And of course, sometimes these factors all converge to make a perfect storm, making a large cancellation immediately imperative, leaving little time to plan communications to campus about the situation. So in 2015, the Canadian dollar took such a sudden dive, as I just mentioned, and a number of libraries across the country decided to cancel a big deal quickly. Luckily at that time, we at the USask Library didn't need to do this, but Jacqueline, Charlene, and we watched the situation unfold at other institutions across the country with interest and a lot of sympathy. And we noticed some negative media attention generated by this seemed to be driven by angry faculty responses, basically. And here are two screenshots of examples from the time with their subtitles highlighted. Both of these news articles focus on angry backlash from faculty. So indeed, it is likely one reason libraries have delayed canceling journal packages for as long as they have, precisely because we, libraries, fear this kind of faculty backlash. And vendors have been known to feed this fear too. So all of this seemed remarkably unfair to the three of us. You know, librarians are generally mission driven to facilitate access to information for our campuses. We don't want to cancel journals. But these situations, the factors that I mentioned, they're beyond our control and they force us to. So then to be on the receiving end of such angry backlash is especially frustrating. So we wondered, the three of us wondered, if there was some way that libraries could better communicate to faculty about the situations, these factors, driving journal cancellations, so that they, meaning the faculty, would support the library. Although there's a lot of literature out there on assessment techniques to determine what to cancel, there is little to none on strategies to effectively communicate these decisions to the campus. Hence our research. Okay, next slide. So here's our research question. What are some effective strategies for communicating to campus about collections cancellations? And the subtext here, of course, is so that faculty will understand and support the library. And for the scope, we limited data collection for both phases of this study to the 29 Carl member libraries, simply to make the study manageable. But this doesn't mean that the results are only applicable to research libraries. We think they could be generally useful to other types of academic libraries and to libraries in other countries too, of course. Okay, so I mentioned two phases a few times now. So the first phase, we collected publicly available documents communicating about major collections cancellations from Carl Library websites and performed a qualitative content analysis on these documents. The main goal for this first phase was essentially to perform an environmental scan to see if we could determine any trends in how libraries communicated about cancellations and also to help us plan for the next phase of the study. So phase two, semi-structured interviews of Carl librarians responsible for communications about cancellations. So we were hoping in this phase that these librarians could share with us their experiences of what worked and what didn't at their institution. And then we could come up with some effective strategies from that. So we did present results from each of these phases at these conferences, as is on the slide, and the links to the slides are in the notes slide at the end of this presentation. They're all posted in our repository in Harvest. So in this presentation, we'll mostly focus on phase two results, since this is the phase funded by Carl. But first, let me briefly go over the methods and results for phase one, because it kind of feeds into phase two. Okay, so in the summer of 2017, we, the three of us, searched or browsed the websites of each of the 29 Carl libraries, excluding ourselves at USask, looking for any public communications created or shared by the library about collections cancellations. So if you're interested, you can look at the notes field on this slide, and I've included more specific information about our inclusion and exclusion criteria. The final sample included 74 documents from 12 different libraries. Libraries ranged from having one document to one library actually had 27 documents. So it was pretty diverse. We performed a pretty standard qualitative content analysis after an initial read through of all these documents, we each developed rough codes and then came together and to discuss and agree upon a final code book. And then we each independently coded all 74 documents, came together again to discuss what we observed and grouped the codes into themes. And we came to a consensus on 5 themes that we saw across all these documents. So I have them on the next slide here. So I'll just explain verbally, just from this slide, what we kind of saw for each of these five themes. So the first one, stewardship and reassurance. This theme is characterized by the library providing reassurances to the campus that, and there's a whole list of things, that they are being good stewards of the collection budget, that librarians are professionals with expertise, that we, the librarians, have already done everything we can to avoid cancellations, that other libraries are also experiencing this, i.e. we are not alone is what we started calling this. Also a reassurance that the collection is still good despite these cancellations, and that users will still be able to access canceled content. So through interlibrary loan or whatever other means. And the overall message of this theme is that the situation not due to any of our mismanagement on the library's part. So stewardship, we're being good stewards, we're not mismanaging, and the sky is not falling. So you're still able to access canceled resources and the collection is still good. This theme of stewardship appears again in the interview data in phase 2. The second theme that we noticed amongst all of these documents was education and justification is what we called it. Nearly all libraries use their communications to try to educate about all of the factors that I mentioned earlier that are driving the need to cancel. So currency exchange, unsustainable inflation of pricing, budgetary challenges. This was so universal that we started calling it a recipe. And there are often attempts to contextualize the numbers, to use metaphors, to put the information into perspective. And so all of these factors justified the need to cancel. The third theme, transparency and assessment. This theme captured all of the attempts by the library to communicate and consult with the campus about the cancellations or proposed cancellations, providing contact emails for more information, offering to meet or present to groups, requesting feedback, all in an effort to be transparent. And many libraries also presented their assessment techniques and quantitative evidence, such as usage, cost per use, overlap data, that kind of thing. And these supported their cancellation decisions. So theme 4, again, along the way, we just kind of noticed some interesting vocabulary choices, such as libraries using the term cost reductions, seemingly maybe to avoid the word cancellations, we're not sure. And just other examples of jargon we took note of. But on the whole, the tone of most of these communications seemed calm, straightforward, professional, although there were some more dramatic ones too, which was interesting. And the last theme, open access and advocacy, was more about what we expected to see more of, but didn't. And so libraries mostly stated the unsustainable pricing of journals and big deals in an even-toned way, simply stating a fact, but with 1 or 2 notable exceptions. Most libraries refrain from taking any strong stance in advocating for long-term change in the scholarly publishing system towards sustainability and openness. Of course, their verbal communications could have been different. Remember, we were just looking at the textual communications at this point. So as I mentioned earlier, the goal of the first phase content analysis was to get a sense of the trends, what libraries generally talk about in their textual communications, and to help us formulate the interview questions for phase 2. So phase 1 was limited, of course, by what we could find publicly posted on library websites. And we knew there was likely much more communicating that went on. So we needed to talk to some of the librarians involved. And so that started phase 2. So in this next phase, we want to talk to the librarians that were directly involved with communicating about cancellations to see what we could learn from them about effective strategies. So we identified potential participants at Carle Libraries through their online profiles, activities, and our own knowledge of the relatively small community of academic librarians in Canada. This was a purposive sampling technique, so we focused on librarians with collections responsibilities and preferably some indication of administrative duties too, with the assumption that they would have some kind of strategic input into how their library communicates with its campus community. And 17 agreed to participate in the interviews. So we developed and tested a semi-structured interview guide earlier in the process when we applied for ethics approval. We conducted and recorded the interviews using WebEx. Each session was about 45 to 60 minutes long, and all in English, and recordings were then transcribed and anonymized. And similar to what we did in phase 1, we developed a code book after preliminary readings of the interview transcripts. And we each coded the 17 transcripts independently. And we used an inductive method of coding, meaning that the descriptive codes emerged directly from the data. We then sorted the codes into categories and finally into themes. Very similar strategy to the first phase. Okay, so let's talk about these 6 themes that we came up with. So through this qualitative analysis of the interview transcript, we arrived at these 6 main themes. And like I said, I'll go through the first 3 myself, and then I'll pass over to Jacqueline, and she can continue on. So we've provided a few details about each of the themes, and then a representative quotation from one of our participants, which will illustrate the themes. But if you'd like to see more quotations, certainly go to our paper that I mentioned earlier. And we have several different quotations for each theme in there. Okay, so the first one, university librarians' role. The theme from our interviews that seemed to have the most impact on campus communications was the active involvement of the university librarian, or dean or director, whatever the title may be at the institution. And it was really interesting. This was the first thing that all 3 of us commented on when we came together after the coding, because it was such a dominant theme. And we didn't actually ask a question about this in our interview guide. It just was something that each participant brought up. So the university librarian's active involvement with senior university administration, this included deans, VPs, and others, ideally resulted in these administrators having a good understanding of the issues and challenges around those factors I mentioned earlier, the currency exchange problem, inflation, scholarly publishing environment. This is important because these individuals have considerable power and can assist in making sure the message is heard by faculty and the reasons for cancellation are understood. So let's be honest, often a message to faculty from a dean or a vice president likely carries more weight and gets more attention than a message from a librarian. So having these people be allies is very helpful. This was not necessarily easy though. The conversations with senior administrators needed to start early and be reinforced over time for the issues to sink in and be fully understood. And excellent communication skills on the part of the university librarian really helped in order to explain these complex issues and to win over these powerful allies. Of all the senior administrators, the university librarian's relationship with the provost was perhaps the most important and was a way to build support on campus for these difficult decisions that the library would need to make. However, relying on this communications channel alone was not sufficient to ensure that the message was heard and understood by others on campus. So for example, we heard a few stories of deans who didn't pass on information to faculty in their colleges. So the more successful communication strategies combined several approaches and support from senior administration through the University Librarian communications was one very important aspect. So I have a representative quote here from participant 10. Have someone in your court, the dean or UL, who can really be a very strong communicator and understand how to mobilize allies and really express the library's interest in really compelling terms. So like I said, there's more quotes illustrating this theme in our paper, if you're interested. So the second theme, relationships and in-person interactions. So also important was in-person communication and building relationships across campus, which over time built trust and credibility. This doesn't help, of course, if you have a sudden cancellation to make, but hopefully the library has been investing in these kind of relationships for years already. Participants in our interviews felt that fostering relationships all along was important. So if you're sharing bad news, such as journal cancellations, ideally you want your networks to be already in place to be effective. So the library just shouldn't pop up on an email or attend a meeting with bad news, but should be sharing all kinds of information regularly. And finding ways to communicate actually in person was preferable, or at least in addition to these mass emails, which the emails can often go unread and they don't really help people understand the issues. So various in-person communications were effective, such as holding town halls, open sessions, participating in faculty council meetings or other university level meetings, and also meeting with faculty members one-on-one too, of course. We heard that negative situations turned around with an in-person discussion. So anger and frustration from faculty seem to be diffused when dealing with them face-to-face, for the most part. So here's a representative quote for this theme. Even though there was a lot of sort of immediate reaction and blasting emails and angry phone calls in every case, as soon as we sort of talked about the issues in person, the conversation changed entirely. So the idea here is when you're in person face-to-face, it will diffuse anger in many instances, hopefully. Okay, so the third theme, again, stewardship, as we saw in phase 1, we found it again here in phase 2. A universal challenge is that most people outside the library do not understand these complex issues, and why should they? And they generally don't realize how much the library does to manage electronic resources. Our interview participants found it helpful when communicating to campus to demonstrate their professional expertise and knowledge and make it clear that the financial implications are well understood by the library. And the library has collection management under control. So again, similar to phase 1, we haven't messed this up. We know what we're doing. Cancellations are not the result of any mismanagement on the library's part. So for example, participants noted that faculty members would suggest things like getting together with other libraries to get better deals, which of course is something academic libraries have been doing for many years with consortia. Non-library people also don't seem to understand that the situation isn't unique to their institution. So here's again the idea of we are not alone that came up in the first phase as well. So it was necessary to explain to faculty that this is a global phenomenon and all libraries are facing these challenges. It's not just us, and it's not happening because the library mismanaged something. We're being good stewards of the collection funds. And finally, undertaking assessment and evaluation of the collection and having this data available at any time increases transparency and helps build trust. Sharing evidence and being ready to explain the context to any stakeholder was identified as a key way to build trust in the library's expertise. So demonstrating expertise could build trust that we know what we're doing and we're making the best decisions based on the evidence and our professional knowledge. So representative quote for this theme. And gradually, as we explain things, they were able to sit back and go, yeah, that's a problem, isn't it? There's no way you can buy all that stuff, can you? It was just kind of a disbelief that we knew what we were doing. Okay, so that is the end of theme 3, and Jacqueline's going to take over. So I'll stop sharing.
And I will unmute myself, which is the step I almost forgot. So thanks Dee Dee. I'm going to take it now with our 4th theme, which is internal library communication. Several of our participants told us that one of the first things to do is to make sure that everyone in the library, including the student casuals, understands that cancellations are underway, that they understand the scope, the reasons why, and how to direct the questions that they receive. Ensuring that the library speaks with one voice is a way to build trust on campus. Making sure that employees at all the public service desks know where to get information and how to redirect questions helps reassure them that they don't need to be the experts. Our quote from P17 was, "I spent a lot of time presenting what the project was, how we were going about it, coaching folks, answering questions internally to build trust." So our participants noted that providing mentorship and support for liaisons about the issues in collections assessment was important. But we know these issues are really complicated. So expecting liaison librarians to be able to explain them comprehensively might have been a bit of a challenge. Many of our participants thought it made sense to capitalize on the liaison librarian model and use these existing relationships to communicate with the campus. However, we did hear that this type of communication was often quite uneven. That we didn't talk to any liaison librarians, so we couldn't speak to their experience. But some of our participants felt they could have better equipped the librarians with more tools and information beyond some of the talking points or slide decks that some of them did provide. So our 5th theme looked at the intersection of cancellations and scholarly communications. So the idea of tying the broader problems of scholarly communication to the canceling of collections was a very strong theme in our interviews. The sentiment was that the crisis the library is facing is an opportunity to help faculty understand the scholarly publishing system and its problems. We know that cancellations are often seen as a library problem rather than a university-wide problem, and that faculty do not necessarily see their role in perpetuating the system that has ultimately resulted in the collections cancellations they are now experiencing. Some of our participants spoke very passionately about the library's role in driving change to a more sustainable and equitable publishing model by educating members of their campus community. Participant 13 said, "So really, moving the discussion away from, here's the library coming to you with a library problem, to here's the library presenting you with an issue that we all need to be part of," which is a really key shift in the message. Our 6th theme was national leadership and community sharing. And even though our participants stated that educating faculty about the issues is very important, they noted that doing this on one campus isn't enough, that it will take a coordinated effort to affect change in the scholarly publishing system. So though this coordination is important, it is, of course, as we all know, not simple. For example, in Canada, we struggle with a dispersed geography, with a variety of regional and national consortia with a range of mandates, and a range of sizes and types of academic institutions with different interests. As participant 6 said, it's a coordinated message and strategy that can't be done on one library or one institution's campus. We're all facing the same challenges on our own individual campuses. So beyond the major themes we found, we also received a lot of advice from our participants that we wanted to share with you. These little nuggets of advice were provided by our participants in direct response to a question in our interviews about what advice they would give to others if they were found in the situation of a major cancellation. So communicate early and often. This was the most consistent and the most emphatic advice, but we were also cautioned by participants that people shouldn't start too early because you want to avoid the idea that the sky is falling. But also remember that it takes time to get organized. You have to start preparing very early in order to have your communications organized to release in time. The need to cancel can happen very quickly, as we've seen in 2015 and in other times. So it may be best to have a communications plan in place just in case before you need it. So you don't have to take the time to build the plan in a short-term situation. You want to also make sure you're using different channels and audiences and figure out which ones work best at your institutions. Does everything go from the provost and the deans and filter down? Do you need to present to Senate or talk to other bodies on campus? You want to adapt that message for your different audiences and consider not just levels like staff or students and faculty and admins, but also consider disciplines. Science might need a different message than humanities faculty, for example. You just want to try to ensure that the essence of your messages stays consistent and that they're ready to go when you need them, and that you're trying to adapt to the different people who receive their communications in different ways. It's also important to accept that some people will just always be beyond your reach and you will never reach everyone. Participant 11 said, communicate early. Don't try to use a one-size-fits-all approach because people who work in different disciplines have very different ways of very different relationships to data and evidence. Our second little set of advice here, be transparent and track it. Show people the evidence and the numbers, and this came up also in our phase 1 results. You want to show people the actual costs and inflation rates as much as you're able to. Often people on campus outside the library have no idea how much these things cost, and so it can be very powerful to communicate and share. You want to post your communications, your data, and your analysis publicly on the library website. It's helpful to have a convenient place to point people to for further information, or if they mention later that they don't feel they were consulted or communicated with, you can point to this as the track record of all the communications you did complete. You want to be as transparent and proactive and as informative as possible without overwhelming people with information is critical. I curved it a little, that's participant 10. So you also want to reassure and redirect. You want to reassure them that we're not canceling the entire collection. Be clear about the impact of the cancellations and also talk about alternative ways to get access. So this falls also into some of the results from phase 1. You can reassure people that interlibrary loan will address their needs, or there's aggregator databases or open access tools like Unpaywall. Trying to keep your messaging clear, concise, and consistent, even though it's complex, but trying to simplify your messages, maybe providing links to background information so you don't have to overwhelm the main messages. Keeping your tones calm and straightforward, authoritative and professional, while being proactive and informative, can be especially difficult when we know we're living right now in a time when people like to get their information as sound bites. It is almost impossible to distill some of these issues to a sound bite. The last set of advice was more for the librarians. Keeping your chin up. Remember that there is no ideal time to get feedback from your faculty, and no matter how well-intentioned you are, you will not reach everyone, and that is not your failure. You want to do the best you can, and don't be mortified if you don't achieve perfection. You can talk to people at other institutions, see what they've done and what they're thinking, share experiences and learn from each other and support each other through these processes. You also want to keep communicating. As Dee Dee mentioned earlier on, you don't want the first time someone hears from you that you're canceling their favorite resource. Having some of those relationships and communications already in place can be really effective and helpful. So now I want to talk about an opportunity that we had at the University of Saskatchewan to apply some of these results before we had even finished our project. So in autumn 2018, it was clear we were going to need to make significant cancellations, which meant our first big deals, as Dee Dee mentioned, and they took effect in January 2020. So as this realization was sinking in, we as a research team were just wrapping up our coding and our theming of interview transcripts. So I'm going to show you a few of the slides we used with our faculty presentations. So this was our timeline. So this was our first big deal cancellation, and it was also our first major campus-wide communication plan. Luckily, the library had recently hired a communications official, but he relied on us as the subject experts to provide the content and the context for the messaging. So Dee Dee and I met with the team leading the cancellation project in January 2019 to share our findings and share our expertise also from our backgrounds in scholarly communications and electronic resources. Charlene was on administrative leave, and that's why she didn't join us at that time. So we shared our findings from phase 1 and what was coming out of the early analysis of our data from phase 2. We did in-person presentations at every college and school and with graduate students in the spring of 2019. And at every presentation, there was a member of library administration and a collections librarian. We conducted a survey of faculty, graduate students, and administrators in the summer of 2019. and we implemented our decisions in the autumn. We also presented to some other groups in campus in the fall, including undergraduate students and our teaching and learning committee. So when we were presenting to faculty, we talked a lot about the pressure that currency fluctuation adds in Canada. Like many of you, our collections budget, about 85% of it is billed in US dollars in the original currency. We framed our messages around the broken for-profit scholarly publishing market and talked in general about how this works, which is what this slide was illustrating. We developed and implemented communications for our actual cancellation while we were wrapping up this research project. So it was real EBLIP in action, something which we had hoped for, but hadn't really thought it would happen as fast as it did. So this is a screenshot of our collections website. So I worked on this project from the beginning to the end, wearing my e-resources hat, and then also working with communication. So our strategy was driven by our research project and what we had learned from our colleagues internationally. And we think we were somewhat lucky. As we launched our communications plan, the University of California announced the end of their negotiations with Elsevier. The profile of that significant cancellation and the way they communicated ended up helping us, that kind of not alone idea again. That some faculty were more aware of the issues because they'd heard about UC, or if they hadn't and we mentioned it, it helped communicate the significance of the issues. So we continued to update the website throughout the year. We added new posts, we updated FAQ, and we added to the list of presentations and the slide decks that we used on campus. So we're now working on transitioning it from a project-focused section of the website to add more context about the library budget for this year and into the future, while hopefully maintaining the integrity of this project. We've heard from several other libraries in North America that having a place to look at all the communication in one place and the transparent model of communication we adopted was valuable and has been used by other libraries since. A bit of hindsight. So as Dee Dee mentioned, that specter of angry faculty was hanging over us. And at every stage in our plan, we thought about mitigation of negative reactions. We thought about how to reach as many people as possible and how we would react if there was blowback, so we wouldn't be surprised. Well, now that we're through, we've implemented as of January. I'm happy to share that not only did we not get shouted at a single time, but that many of the messages and comments we received were supportive or understanding in nature. Of course, no one was excited. No one's excited about losing access to those journal collections. But in general, once the reasoning and evidence was presented, they understood it. No one contacted us more than once with questions or concerns. And all of the emails we received were seeking information to help understand a specific situation. Someone was looking for details about a particular title, or to understand the scope of scholarly publishing, or they had questions about the speed of interlibrary loan. We found that involvement from library administration with this project added credibility and support and gravitas and really made it clear the importance of this project. It was one of the keys to our success. If you are curious about the other piece of managing big cancellation project, the data management and kind of collections assessment piece, I'm working on writing up those findings right now with my colleague Ken Ladd. We're looking at it from a how do you decide what to buy back, or how did we decide what to buy back kind of perspective. And our slides from the Canadian Library Assessment Workshop are linked in our notes slide. So we were really lucky. We avoided a major cancellation until recently. And then when it happened, we, like Dee Dee and Charlene and I, had been working on this research since 2017. And we've been thinking about it really deeply for those 3 years before, or 2 years before we had to lead a project ourselves. That time for deep thinking and to plan our cancellation, even though it didn't feel long enough when we were in the middle of it, was much more time than others have had in our situation. Also, having the opportunity to apply our findings has made us more confident about the themes and conclusions we found in this study and made this project really satisfying for myself, I'll say. So I'll just share some final thoughts here before we move into the discussion. So we really found that we found some things that we thought needed more thought and exploration through our research. So in order to communicate early and build credibility, you need time, but we know cancellations can often happen on short timelines. So how can you do it when there's no time? And so we thought about, spending that time building the relationships and setting up the structures for communication can help you, even if you don't have a lot of lead time before the actual communications happen or when the crisis hits. Providing information in an ongoing way about how scholarly publishing works and how it's broken to faculty is something we can do anytime. We know that faculty are authors, reviewers, and editors of journals, but they're not often fully aware of the severity or extent of the issues inherent in the system. This study also really brought home that collections and scholarly communications librarians should really be working together and so they can strategically address these issues whenever they're available. So as we've already mentioned, we really found a significant difference between open access advocacy between phase 1 and phase 2 of our projects. Some of the ideas we came up with for why this might be, it could just be the passage of time. It was almost 3 years between the initial crisis and our interviews in summer 2018. There have been conversations more recently about perceived neutrality of libraries and a growing acceptance of not just an opportunity, but a responsibility for librarians to call out profiteering public publishing. There have also been more high-profile cancellations, more discussions about academic journal publishing, and some of those transformative agreements that Dee Dee talked about earlier. Participants may also have felt more comfortable speaking freely in an anonymous interview with their colleagues than they would have in written communications for the public. Or it's possible that communication by committee might have softened some of the ideas and messages, right? When you're writing in a group for a public audience that you can't have those conversations with as follow-up, you might write more subtle messaging. A final thought from participant 5. So we know that cancellations are driven by external forces. They don't allow much lead time. We're hoping that the evidence collected in this study supports libraries in the preemptive development of effective and strategic communication practices. And we anticipate that the results will encourage libraries to raise the awareness of faculty administrators about the challenges of the current publishing ecosystem. So even if there isn't a lot of time when you're facing a cancellation, we've gathered some useful elements that could help you build a successful communication plan in our results that might help you identify some of the key features of what you need to accomplish. We're also always happy to talk more about our research and our local experience if you would find that valuable. So I'll just note that in the slide deck, which you can get from the CARL website, you can see the notes to our different results. We want to thank CARL for supporting the second phase of our research through their grant in 2017. And we really want to thank our participants for taking the time to share their experiences and their knowledge. Our contact information is here. You can reach myself, Dee Dee, or Charlene by email at USask or on Twitter. We're all there. And we'll now move into questions and discussions, and I will stop sharing my screen.
Thanks, Jacqueline and Dee Dee. That was fantastic. Just a reminder that you can type your questions using the Q&A feature on the bottom menu of your screen. We will also accept questions via chat. So I'm just going to give people a few minutes to type those in. Okay, first question. Thanks for this. Did you look at whether libraries had hired non-librarians, comms experts?
You want me to take this one, Dee Dee? Sure. So we heard from a lot of libraries that in 2015 or 16, they didn't have a communications person. But by the time we talked to them in the summer of 2018, a lot of them had hired communications experts. But from what I can recall, most of them were not library people. They were more communications professionals working in a library situation.
Thanks. Second question. It sounds like you looked at a lot of public communications posted on websites. Did your interviews with librarians responsible for communicating cancellations to the users give you access to less public communications, e.g. email messages to faculty, students, surveys, etc.?
Well, some of the librarians, when we interviewed them, certainly offered and then followed up and sent us those documents that were not publicly posted. By that point, we didn't try to include those extra documents in our research at that time because it just wasn't part of the methods that we had set up. And we hadn't collected or asked to collect those additional documents from every one of the participants. So we didn't follow up that angle, no.
But it was interesting to see the ones that people did share, just kind of as an extra, you know, like we're involved in this kind of work in our library. So we're also just, I don't know, for myself, I guess I'm kind of nosy and interested in what did everybody else do so I can learn from it and replicate it in my own work.
Okay. Next question, what can you recommend to subject librarians who have been told by their admin that there will be no database cancellations communications given centrally? How can we communicate this on our own without negatively impacting our relationship with faculty?
Liaison, you want to take this one?
So I don't know. So I have my own professional and personal opinions. I'm a science librarian, and one of my faculties I support is chemistry. And so anybody out there who is a chemistry librarian knows that the American Chemical Society has this very aggressive pricing policy. So this isn't necessarily all about commercial publishers being very aggressive in their pricing. Certainly nonprofit societies can be as well. And so the American Chemical Society bundle of journals is very valuable and very high quality and very expensive, as is SciFinder, their database. And so since I became a liaison to them about 10 years or so ago, I've constantly been discussing with them this situation. Simply because I knew at some point there might be a situation where we would need to break up that ACS bundle. And so, you know, they lost quite a few titles in the Wiley collection that we canceled. And so they were not happy, but because I had spent all of this time on my own as a liaison, talking with them about the situation, not just with ACS, of course, but with publishing in general. Certainly chemistry journals are the most expensive journals out there. So I wanted them to know that because I thought it was something they should know professionally. And that this was something that was out of our control. And so they have been prepared for all of these years that this might happen. And so I think constantly having these conversations with faculty whenever it comes up, whenever you have the opportunity, is helpful. Not meaning to throw the library under the bus or anything, but just being honest and transparent, like we were saying, just so that they know what's happening. So I'm not sure if that answered the first part of the question. What was the second part?
Well, and maybe I'll jump in, Dee Dee.
Okay.
Because I think if your administration isn't feeling that a cancellation is significant enough to communicate about, you can continue to try. Ginger, be quiet. You can continue to try to advocate with them for why you feel it's important. You could share some of your findings or hear some comments you've heard from your faculty. I guess if there's no will to communicate centrally, you could also try to adopt some of these strategies for your communication with your faculty and maybe share them with your colleagues in order to help ease their communication with different faculties. That might help things. One of the things we found in our first phase of research was that not every cancellation is a major cancellation or maybe needs to be communicated as comprehensively, right? It may not have the same kind of impact, or it may not be as widespread or as significant. It could be more of this is just how the library does its business kind of a cancellation. And those are different, that's a different level of communication, which might be why there isn't a major central communication happening.
Okay. Next question. Do you have any suggestions on how to balance the need to communicate versus consult? We also ran a faculty survey, but are also planning to have a round of consultation before we cancel. Do you think this is needed? How much power should faculty have in reversing our decision?
I think pretty much all of the libraries that we looked at and the librarians that we spoke to talked about consultation. Is that true, Jacqueline? I'm trying to remember.
Yeah, we saw a continuum almost. There was some kind of consultation and communication, and then some collaboration at some universities where they had like faculty library councils where they would work together in their decisions.
Yeah, and I think communicating and consulting are kind of go hand in hand. I mean, we want the faculty to feel like they have had a voice in these decisions, but also to know that they can't unilaterally decide. I mean, the final decision rests with the library because this is our professional expertise and responsibility to undertake this, but we can assure them that we will look at whatever suggestions or advice that they have, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
I'm seeing one more question. Are you looking at ILL statistics post-cancellation?
So we're looking at some. The system we're using at USask for interlibrary loan doesn't really do a lot for stats that we can get easily. So we've been looking at some of the logs and information, and it looked like there was maybe a slight increase in January, but we also can't get out of our system for what titles. So we don't know if it was an increase for Wiley and Taylor and Francis journals. We also know that the publishers didn't cut us off until February, so we don't think that could have been the case. I think it's kind of difficult, and we've heard from other places who have had major cancellations that where they have been able to measure interlibrary loan increases, it's maybe been in the neighborhood of 5%. It's been a very small increase, but I think a lot of interlibrary loan systems don't seem to have the capability to provide detailed information about what's being requested, which can be a real challenge if you're trying to look at the impact of the cancellations.
Okay,
That's all I had to say, sorry.
Okay. So I'm not seeing any more questions coming in. Dee Dee and Jacqueline, is there anything you'd like to add before we close? I know you mentioned that people can get in touch with you if they have questions at a later date.
Yeah.
Well, I'm curious. Sorry, Jacqueline.
Go ahead, Dee Dee. I was just going to say, we're kind of wondering and thinking that some libraries may be facing some cancellations with really accelerated timelines this year, and that whether this might be an opportunity to have some of those conversations about how can you do this on an accelerated timeline? How can we use what we know to get ahead of it as much as possible? I know there's uncertain budget situations in many provinces right now due to extreme circumstances. We're all mostly working off campus and providing online library access only. So how can we address the needs of our communities to get access to collections online when we have to also manage budgets that are shrinking and address the fact that these big deal collections and electronic resources make up the bulk of how we spend our budget. So we just thought this might be a great place to jump off for future conversations for things that might be happening in the next few months.
And since we have a few minutes left, if there's still people here that have had their own big deal cancellations and have additional advice that we didn't cover, I would certainly love to hear it too. So please add that in the chat or the Q&A as well.
Mm-hmm.
I think the thing that most, because I'm a liaison, I wasn't so involved as Jacqueline was with our own cancellations, except on the one-on-one kind of level with my faculty. And I was really actually impressed by how well they handled it. They weren't happy, like I said. They weren't happy, but they didn't blame us, and I was quite happy with that myself,
Yeah.
And I wanted to reassure them and tell them that, we could get back things that we'd lost. But really, I mean, things, I don't know, this is just the way things are, and we have to get used to it, because this isn't the end of it, I think, until the system changes.
Mm-hmm.
One comment here, many of the USask faculty reactions were along the lines of, how can we help?
Yes. Yeah, we heard from lots of faculty, a few faculty who said, well, why didn't you just cancel Elsevier? Let's take a stand. And we were using a really principled data-driven approach. So we weren't really ready for that reaction. We thought there'd be more frustration at the cancellations rather than like, yeah, take out the big guys. But there was a lot of like, well, what can I do to help you? That was the only question we got asked at every single faculty council presentation, was what can we do? How can we change what we're doing to help?
And if you want to know how we answered that, we did develop an FAQ that is still on that library website that Jacqueline had a screenshot from. So you can go and see how we answered that FAQ.
Yeah.
How can they help?
Yeah, and there's a direct link in our slides, or if you go to the library.usask.ca and just scroll to the bottom, there's a link to the collections budget page. Yeah, I guess we're almost out of time. Maybe just say, how do you encourage them? Oh, Lisa, that's a big question. So Lisa's asking, how do you encourage them to change where and how they publish? Do you have any suggestions on that, Dee Dee?
Yeah, in the FAQ, we addressed that. We didn't just say publish in open access journals, of course, because many of these commercial publishers are now co-opting open access journals and charging huge article processing charges. So basically just flipping the unsustainability from the library to the authors. And the authors are very aware of this and of course, and against it. And so I think the advice that we gave in the FAQ was to look for sustainable or ethical open access publications. And if you don't have any, then at least post the postprint in the repository.
Yeah, and we also talked about if you're on a society board, how you could change your society publication, or to think about where you provide your peer review. We gave them those kinds of suggestions, but we also talked about tenure and promotion standards, but almost every time that came up, the dean, if they were in the room, would pull a face. Like, oh no, don't say that. Because we all know reviewing standards isn't anyone's favorite. Thanks for that question.
Great, so I think we're out of time. On behalf of Carl, I'd like to thank our presenters for this excellent presentation and all of our participants for attending. The recording should be available shortly, and we ask that you keep an eye out for upcoming webinars and community calls in our series. Have a great week, everyone. Basin bonne semaine.
Okay. Thank you, everyone, for attending.